When Kirk Douglas passed away in 2020, he left behind more than a legacy, he left behind a home with secrets. The Beverly Hills estate, where the legendary actor lived for decades, was sold a few years later to an unsuspecting couple, James and Emily Thornton. They were drawn to the house for its Hollywood history, but they soon discovered that the spirit of its former owner might never have left. James and Emily were no strangers to old homes, but there was something about this one that felt different. It wasn't just the grand entryway, the sunlit garden, or the intimate home theater where Douglas had once watched films of a bygone era. No, it was the feeling that they were never truly alone. It started with small things. Doors left ajar when they were sure they had closed them. The faint scent of cigar smoke lingering in the study despite neither of them smoking. At first, they chalked it up to their imagination. Then came the nights. One evening, Emily decided to test out the home theater. She put on Spartacus, a tribute to the home's former owner. As the film played, she swore she heard another voice, soft, amused, whispering in the darkness. When she muted the sound, the whispering stopped. But as soon as she pressed play, it began again. James was skeptical until he experienced it himself. One night, he stayed up late working in Douglas' old study. He heard the distinct sound of a man clearing his throat behind him. When he turned around, no one was there. The leather chair by the fireplace rocked ever so slightly, as if someone had just stood up. The final straw came when Emily woke up in the middle of the night. She needed water, so she quietly slipped out of bed and padded down the long hallway. As she reached the kitchen, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Standing at the far end of the hallway was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair swept back. He wore a robe, much like the one Douglas was known to favor in his later years. He wasn't threatening, just standing there, watching. Emily froze, heart pounding. But the figure only nodded slightly, turned, and disappeared into the darkness. Terrified, the couple considered selling the house. But before making a decision, James did some research. He dug through old drawers in the study, hoping to find some piece of the past that might explain what they were experiencing. That's when he found it. A handwritten letter, tucked into the back of a drawer. It was addressed to whoever calls this house their home next. The letter was brief but poignant. "This house has been my sanctuary, my escape, my kingdom. If you feel me here, know that I mean no harm. I simply loved this place too much to ever truly leave." It was signed Kirk Douglas. James and Emily never spoke of selling the house again. The noises, the whispers, and even the occasional fleeting shadow became a part of their lives. They no longer felt fear, only reverence. After all, how many people could say they shared a home with one of Hollywood's greatest legends? The days blended into nights, and the house of Kirk Douglas became more than a home to James and Emily. It became a living entity, breathing with history, humming with an unseen presence. It was in the creak of the old wooden floors, in the way the evening light slanted perfectly through the grand windows, as if time itself had memorized its routine within these walls. The house did not feel unwelcoming. It did not feel hostile, but it watched. Emily found herself drawn more and more to the home theater, despite the whispering that sometimes stirred in the darkness. It was a small, intimate space, with velvet seats and heavy drapes that absorbed sound so completely that when the projector flickered to life, the rest of the world ceased to exist. It was easy to imagine Kirk Douglas sitting there, his keen eyes locked onto the screen, reliving his greatest performances, perhaps dissecting them, perhaps simply indulging in the nostalgia of a life well lived. One evening, she selected Paths of Glory, one of his finest films. As the black and white images filled the screen, she settled into a chair, letting the cool leather embrace her. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the projector. James was asleep upstairs. The city outside had long since fallen into its lull, and she was alone. Or so she thought. The first sound was faint, a rustling, like fabric shifting. She turned her head slightly but saw nothing. The room remained still, shadows clinging to the corners like forgotten ghosts. She let out a slow breath and returned her focus to the film. Then the whisper came. It was just behind her, low, a murmur on the edge of sound, a voice wrapped in time. She couldn't make out words, only the cadence calm, deliberate, as though someone was watching along with her, commenting just beneath the threshold of understanding. Her hands clenched the arms of the chair. She swallowed. She didn't turn around. The whispering stopped the moment she reached for the remote and paused the film. The silence was sudden, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Emily stood, her pulse quickening. The air in the room had shifted, not colder, not warmer, just denser, as if the walls were listening. She took a step toward the hallway, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. The urge to run tugged at her, but she resisted, forcing herself to move slowly, deliberately, as if any sudden movement might provoke whatever lingered unseen. The hallway was long and dark, illuminated only by the dim glow of a street lamp filtering through a high window. She had almost reached the bedroom door when a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. A figure. She stopped, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't fully formed, more like the impression of a man, standing near the base of the staircase. The shape of broad shoulders, the suggestion of a robe tied at the waist. It was the same as before, the presence at the end of the hall that had watched her in the night. But this time it did not fade. Emily's fingers trembled as she reached for the light switch, her breath shallow, her heart a drum in her chest. The instant her fingers grazed the switch, the figure moved. Not in a lunge, not in a violent way, but in a shift, turning, stepping away, disappearing into the shadows of the lower floor. The house exhaled. Emily stood frozen, her hands still outstretched, but she did not turn on the light. Somehow she knew it wouldn't have mattered. The presence wasn't something that could be banished by brightness. It was woven into the very fabric of this house, stitched into its history, lingering like an old song that refused to be forgotten. She backed away slowly, slipped into the bedroom, and locked the door. James stirred as she climbed into bed, his voice thick with sleep. "Everything okay?" Emily hesitated. She thought of the shadow, of the whispering in the theater, of the letter hidden in the drawer. "If you feel me here, know that I mean no harm." She swallowed hard. "Yeah," she whispered. "Go back to sleep." But Emily didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house. And somewhere, faintly, she swore she heard the creak of a chair in the study rocking, as if someone had just settled in to watch over his home for another night. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house sat in silence, but it was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of waiting. The old beams and walls, soaked with decades of memory, seemed to breathe around Emily as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The glow from the streetlight outside cast a pale, shifting reflection across the high plaster, and every so often, a shadow from a wind-stirred branch danced across it, twisting like an old specter stretching its limbs. James' slow, even breaths beside her were the only real comfort she had. He slept soundly, unaware of what she had seen, unaware of the weight pressing against her chest. She thought of waking him, of whispering her fears into the dark, but something held her back. It wasn't just fear of sounding foolish, it was something deeper. A feeling, a quiet certainty that speaking of it aloud would solidify it, would cement the presence within their lives in a way that could not be undone. She exhaled slowly and turned onto her side, her eyes drifting toward the bedroom door. It was closed, the lock engaged, but it did not feel like a barrier. The presence was still there, somewhere beyond it, not threatening, not cruel, just there. The night stretched on. Every small creak of the house felt amplified. Every sigh of the wind pressing against the windows sounded like the whisper of something unseen. The weight of exhaustion finally began to pull her under. But it was not sleep in the true sense, it was more like drifting in and out of wakefulness, slipping through layers of awareness, her mind teetering on the edge of dreams. Somewhere in that in-between state, she heard it again. A voice. It wasn't in the room. It wasn't even close. It was distant, carried from another part of the house, just barely audible. A soft murmur, like someone speaking to themselves, the cadence familiar, the tone smooth, aged, commanding even in its quietness. She held her breath, came from below, the study. Emily sat up slowly, careful not to disturb James. Her bare feet touched the cool hardwood floor, and she shivered not just from the temperature, but from something deeper, something instinctive. Still, she found herself standing. She moved toward the door as if drawn by an invisible thread, as if some part of her already knew that this moment had been waiting for her all along. The hallway stretched before her, dark and hushed. The whisper had stopped. She moved carefully, her steps soundless against the runner rug. The air felt heavier down here, as though the house itself was watching. The staircase loomed ahead, its wide, polished steps glowing faintly in the ambient moonlight spilling through the high, arched window above. Then, she heard it again. A rustling, the unmistakable creak of leather shifting. She stopped at the foot of the stairs, her pulse hammering. The study door was open, just slightly, a sliver of darkness within darkness, inviting yet ominous. Emily swallowed, her throat dry. The study had always been one of the most unchanged rooms in the house, the one place where Kirk Douglas' presence still lingered most tangibly. His books still lined the shelves. His desk sat exactly as it had in old photographs. His favorite chair, large, worn, but regal in its own way, remained by the fireplace, as though waiting for its owner to return. She reached out, pushed the door open further. The scent hit her first. Leather and tobacco, the faintest trace of old paper, as though time itself had refused to let go of the past. And then, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw it. The chair was moving, not violently, not in some exaggerated horror movie fashion. It simply rocked slowly, methodically, just the faintest shift, as though someone had only just leaned forward or adjusted their posture. The room was empty. Emily's breath was shallow, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She could not move, could not look away. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the chair stopped. Stillness. Her mind screamed at her to run, to turn on the light, to do something. Instead, she stepped forward. One step, then another. The floor beneath her was cool and solid, grounding her even as her senses told her that this moment was something unreal, something outside the boundaries of normality. She reached the desk. Her fingers brushed against its surface, the wood smooth and familiar beneath her touch. There was nothing out of place, nothing obvious, nothing to suggest that anyone had been here at all. And yet, the chair creaked. Emily's breath caught. The movement was barely perceptible, but it was enough. Enough to know she was not imagining it. Then the whisper came again. This time she understood. Not words, just one. One name, spoken in a low, quiet voice, rich with time, laced with something she could not name. Her name, Emily. She turned fast, too fast, nearly stumbling in her haste. The room was empty, but the scent of tobacco lingered, and the air, thick and charged, felt like it was waiting for something. For her. The weight of the air pressed against her skin, thick and unmoving, like the hush before a thunderstorm. Emily stood frozen in the dim glow of the study, her breath shallow, her body taut with the instinct to flee. But she did not run. She couldn't. Something held her there, not a force, not a presence she could name, but a feeling, an unshakable sense that she had stepped across an unseen threshold and there was no turning back. The her name still echoed in her mind, lingering in the silence like an unfinished sentence. The chair had stilled, the whisper had faded, but the study remained charged, as if it had been disturbed from a long slumber and was waiting, expectant. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening on the edge of the desk. The wood was cool beneath her palm, grounding her, reminding her that she was real, that this was real. And then something shifted, not in the room, not in the air, inside her. A strange, sudden thought flickered through her mind, as foreign as if it had been placed there by something outside herself. Sit down. The idea repulsed her at first. The chair, Kirk Douglas' chair, was not meant for her. It was an extension of the man himself, an object worn by decades of presence, of habit, of ownership. The idea of placing herself in it felt almost sacrilegious. And yet, the thought did not leave. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Her body felt unbearably still, as though any movement, even a breath, would shatter something unseen. Her knees bent before she fully processed the decision. The chair was solid beneath her, the leather cool at first, then warm as it adjusted to her weight. It did not rock, did not creak, just held her, encased her, like an embrace of time itself. Then, the air shifted. Not a breeze, not something external, but an unseen movement in the very fabric of the room. A weight, invisible yet pressing, settled around her shoulders, heavy and knowing. Emily's heartbeat slowed. The fear, sharp and biting only moments ago, dulled to something else, something closer to reverence. She no longer felt alone, but she did not feel afraid. She let her fingers drift over the arms of the chair, tracing the worn grooves, the small imperfections in the leather. How many times had he sat here just like this, thinking, watching, remembering? The room around her blurred, details slipping into the periphery as a strange sensation crawled over her skin. Presence. Not physical, not fully graspable, but there. A flicker at the edge of awareness, like the feeling of being watched in a crowd, like a shadow just outside the reach of light. The scent of tobacco deepened. Emily's fingers tightened on the chair. The study remained still, but her senses told her otherwise. Something was different. The atmosphere had thickened, not with dread, not with malice, but with something old, something settled. Then, a sound, soft, near, the unmistakable scrape of a match being struck. Her breath hitched. She did not move. She did not dare. The scent of smoke curled through the air, rich, familiar, impossibly real. It carried the weight of another time, of years pressed into the very bones of this house. Then, behind her, so close she could feel it, a deep, slow exhale. Not a sigh, not the house settling. A breath. Emily did not turn around. She could not, because somehow some part of her already knew. If she did, she would see him. The breath behind her lingered, warm and steady, stirring the fine hairs at the nape of her neck. It was unmistakably human, alive, but impossibly so. Emily's fingers clenched the leather arms of the chair, her knuckles pale in the dim light. Her heart pounded, each beat a heavy drum against her ribs, but she did not move. She could not move. The air in the study thickened, pressing down on her shoulders like invisible hands, not with malice, not with threat, but with something else, something watchful. The scent of tobacco deepened, curling around her like a whisper from the past, as if the house itself had exhaled a piece of its memory. Then, a voice, low, measured, aged by time but still carrying the weight of presence. You don't have to be afraid. The words did not come from her mind. They did not come from her own fractured thoughts trying to soothe her. They came from behind her. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Every muscle in her body begged her to flee, to bolt from the chair, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the impossible. But her instincts, some strange, buried part of her, told her otherwise. So she stayed. Her fingers trembled as she swallowed, her mouth dry, her voice barely a whisper. Who are you? A beat of silence. The weight in the air did not lessen, nor did the presence retreat. If anything, it felt closer. Then, you know who I am. Emily's skin prickled. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Because she did know. She had known from the first whisper in the theater, from the first glimpse of a shadow at the end of the hall, from the first moment she had set foot in this house and felt watched. Kirk Douglas. His name hung in her mind, unspoken, yet fully realized. The legend, the actor, the icon, the man who had lived and breathed within these walls, who had filled them with his presence for decades. The man who had never truly left. She wanted to turn around. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to look, to see. But another instinct, just as powerful, told her not to. Some things were not meant to be seen. Some things were meant only to be felt. Her breath was slow, measured, her body still. The study remained quiet, the weight in the air shifting, waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it lifted. The scent of tobacco faded. The warmth of the presence ebbed like a tide retreating from the shore. The heaviness in the room dissolved, leaving behind nothing but the quiet, the hum of the house settling, the distant murmur of the city outside. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She was alone, truly alone. Or was she? Her eyes flickered toward the desk. The wood gleamed faintly in the dim light, unchanged, untouched except for one small detail. A single matchstick, sitting atop the polished surface. Emily stared at it, her pulse slow and steady now, her fear replaced by something else, something almost like understanding. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the match. It was warm. A shiver ran through her, not of fear, but of something deeper, something like acknowledgement. She closed her fingers around it. A quiet smile touched her lips. I know. And somewhere, in the unseen corners of the house, the faintest echo of a chuckle drifted through the air. Then silence. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.